What's all the fuss about Serbia? I mean, it's behind the historic Iron Curtain, in the Balkans, and used to be part of the now defunct Yugoslav Republic. So I can't imagine why there's so much debate about this country. Nah, I'm just kidding. Everyone knows that those descriptions are a recipe for disaster. So it makes sense why people voted for it. Thank you to everyone who voted. So, in today's video, we're gonna find the Serbia of each continent, and here's how. I'm gonna comprise my criteria into 3 boxes, in which each entry is gonna have to tick each box. The first requirement will be a former member of a fallen union. Now this is obviously in reference to Yugoslavia, but if you wanted to even go further down the line, you could also say the Ottoman Empire. Although the context will vary for each entry, as they obviously won't be exactly like Yugoslavia or the Ottomans, and nor will they even be associated. It's just a matter of, the role that they played. Box 2 will be the allyship to a major power. So obviously for Serbia, this would be Russia, but they've also for many years tried to join the EU, and still are. So maybe just more broadly, this box will be having gone back and forth from being seemingly Eastern or Western allies, as Serbia kind of just goes back and forth sometimes. And box 3 is where it gets really interesting, as I've made it be ethnic split / territory dispute. Now that may sound like 2 boxes, but I figured since these 2 things go kind of hand in hand, I just put them in the same box. The entries don't have to have both of those applied to them, just at least one, but if it's both, even better. Alright, got it? On to the first entry. Africa, Central African Republic. I can imagine many of you not know too much about the CAR, and I guess I can see why, as for a long time it's been the poorest country on earth, so they aren't really contributors on the global stage. Although I believe Burundi is at the bottom now, but that was a pretty recent change. Either way, in order for me to explain why it's the Serbia of Africa, I'm gonna have to give you a quick history lesson. So during the Scramble of Africa in 1903, one of the main scramblers, if you can call them that, was France, and France colonized what was initially called Ubangi Shari, named after the 2 major rivers of the same names. So considering France already had neighboring colonies in Chad and Middle Congo, this land was soon enough merged into what would be called French Equatorial Africa in 1910. This era under French colonial rule was just straight up brutal, as with many European colonies in Africa. They had what was essentially slavery, with forced labor and inhumane living conditions. During the 1940s and 50s emerged a popular figure, Barthélemy Boganda, who was essentially the Central African MLK Jr., considering that they were both civil rights activists and also have the roots in Christianity, with Boganda being a priest and King a minister, and both having died in sketchy circumstances. Now with MLK, it's well established that he was assassinated, but for Boganda, having died in a plane crash with only 5 people, it hasn't been officially diagnosed as assassination, but it's very likely that there is some foul play at the very least. Right after Boganda's death, the Central African Republic got its independence, although France consistently has had involvement with armed conflicts despite the independence. The mistrust of France has never went away with the large majority of the population, leading to nationwide paranoia. And with nationwide paranoia comes ethnic tensions, because that's what always happens. Currently, it's an ethno-religious split between Muslim Seleka groups and Christian anti-Baleka groups. Although to add more confusion to the table, the Seleka groups have disbanded since 2014, and now all remaining Seleka groups are called ex-Seleka. There's a bunch of other groups and merges that have happened since then, but I feel like I'd lose you if I just went around through all of them. And one advancement in particular I didn't mention on purpose. So since that's fresh on the mind, I'ma just take box 3 straight away. The ethnic divide, and there's also been territory disputes because, of course, there has been, and even some regions declaring independence like the Republic of Lagona, which is a Muslim-majority autonomous region. For box 1, that's also a simple tick, with the CAR's former fallen union being the French Equatorial Africa, no surprises there. And here's why I wanted to save box 2 for last. Now based off everything I just relayed to you, you'd think I'd pick France, right? Wrong! When I said that there was an advancement I purposely didn't mention, it was the fact that the CAR's current government under President Faustin Archange Touadera has enlisted the help of none other than Vladimir Putin's Russia. And that's the reason why I picked the CAR for Africa, as both them and Serbia can relate to the mistrust of the West, and both have Russia as their main ally. Russia's involvement in the CAR is relatively recent, having only started in 2017. Nonetheless, Russia's footprint has already been big, with movies being made like The Tourist, which has been a big hit in the CAR. Basically, it's a movie about some skinny Russian soldier who's antisocial and doesn't get along with the lads, but in the end becomes the hero. I mean, they've only been there for so long, so it'll be interesting what happens in the future. Tangent aside, box 2 is a tick. So I'd say CARs are pretty good fit, and I imagine not many of you expected to hear that Russia has gotten involved with Africa, but either way, let's move on to the next one. Asia, Armenia. Armenia is a little bit more well known than the CAR, so my retelling of history for it will be much more brief. For box 1, I have 2 candidates. The first one being the Ottoman Empire. Now I know that Armenia has been a part of many fallen empires in history, but I think for a modern context, the Ottoman Empire is the most relevant. Different parts of Armenia have been under Ottoman rule at different times, so I really can't put an exact date on it, especially considering that Armenia's original empire has vastly different borders than the Armenia of today. And if you know anything about the history of Armenia, then you know that Christianity runs deep within the culture. And if you know anything about the Ottomans, then you'll know that Islam runs deep within their culture. So you already know there's going to be an ethno-religious split. Now allow me to irresponsibly skip ahead to the 1800s, where the Ottoman Empire, now riddled with ethno-religious conflicts, sought to modernize itself through a series of reforms during what was called the Tanzimat. In the eyes of a lot of Armenians, though, these reforms fell short of addressing the rights and autonomy of the Armenian people, causing ethnic tensions to still linger, despite the efforts to move past it. Now let's fast track to the early 20th century, where the Ottoman Empire is on its last legs and World War I is looming. In a tragic turn of events, the Ottoman leadership perpetrates what would later be called the Armenian Genocide. Terms and conditions apply. Now again, this all happened during World War I, and the Ottoman Empire, being a central power, took a huge hit after a long-winded string of armistice and treaties, effectively ending the Ottoman Empire, which transitions nicely into the second candidate, which is the Soviet Union. Because after gaining independence from the Ottomans in 1918, just 2 years later, Armenia willingly joined the USSR. This can be attributed to many things, like the Orthodox Christianity connection and a growing Bolshevik influence. But most agree that the main reason was to have the Soviet military protect Armenia from any potential invasions from now Turkey. And this actually worked quite well for the most part until the Soviet Union inevitably collapsed, as we all know. But even to this day, Russia and Armenia still have close ties. Now the reason why this is significant for the video is because Serbia was also once under Ottoman rule, as well as having ties to Russia too. So while we're at it, let's also tick box 2, because there's a historical tie to Russia/USSR, and even currently, as I mentioned earlier, they've been part of the Eurasian Customs Union since 2010. And for those of you who are unaware, along with the Eurasian Economic Union, it's sort of like Russia's counter to the European Union and NATO. I also think it's worth mentioning that both Serbia and Armenia are very fond of Greece too. However, the reason for these relationships have different origins, but if a Venn diagram was made, the middle circle would have Christian orthodoxy and a mutual disdain towards Turkey. And for box 3, well duh, this is a tick. Historically, with the Armenian Genocide, terms and conditions apply, with the still going on border disputes with Azerbaijan, which is a whole other thing that I don't have time to explain. But if you know, you know. Alright, every single entry seems to be a small history lesson, so let's see what I picked for the next one. The Americas, Bolivia. This may sound like a bit of a confusing pick, but just hear me out. Nearly every country in the Americas can tick box 1 and 2 in some way or another, so this time I'm going to be focused on box 3. And in my view, Bolivia has the most parallels with Serbia's current predicament. So let's talk about it. For territorial dispute, I'm referencing the Atacama Desert and its access to the sea. This was a part of land that Bolivia lost in the War of the Pacific, a war fought between Chile versus longtime allies Bolivia and Peru. Armistices were made, but it still didn't mean that Bolivia was content with the fact that it no longer had a coastline. Peru also lost some territory, chiefly the Tacna and Arica territories. But 45 years later, in 1929, a compromise was signed that allowed Peru to get Tacna back as long as Chile could keep Arica. This only exacerbated Bolivia's discontent towards its territory loss, as it still hasn't received any land back. Now you may be thinking,
now why does Chile want to keep this land? I mean, Bolivia just wants a coastline, right? I mean, come on. Chile's entire shape is basically one giant coastline, so what makes this one any different?
well, this particular area is rich in lithium deposits, and considering the amount of money that's in that industry, Chile isn't willing to give this piece of land away. Coupled with the fact that Chile has been a longtime ally with Britain, and with Britain being Britain, wanting to have an easy trade with Chile, they're not entertaining the idea of having these lithium deposits be in control of Bolivia, who's always had a rocky relationship with Western nations. And even today, Bolivia is part of a group of American countries known as ALBA, which was founded by a very anti-Western leader in Hugo Chavez. And the other boxes are ticks too. For box 1, because of Bolivia's longtime homogeny with Peru, as Bolivia, which was called Upper Peru at the time, from 1542 to 1824, under the viceroyalty of Peru. And then again, through the short-lived Peru-Bolivian Confederation from 1836 to 1839. So you can take your pick for that one, but either way, it's all Peru. And for box 2, well, it's complicated. As I said, Bolivia has a rocky relationship with the Western nations, with the recent example being the US's war on drugs, because Bolivia's main crop is coca leaves, which makes cocaine, but when it's used in its leaf form, it's just chewed for a quick boost of energy. And no, I'm not kidding, this actually happens. They are sold in the bowls by street vendors. Coca leaf consumption is actually so prevalent in Bolivia that the former president of Bolivia was actually a coca leaf farmer. I don't think I have enough time to explain Morales, because his whole situation is complicated to say the least. Nonetheless, Bolivia is now leaning more towards the east in recent years, as diplomatically they don't get along with the west too well. Since they are part of ALBA, as I mentioned earlier, which is like a union between American countries that practice socialism, and since the US is a pretty anti-socialist nation, influences the west so much, then it means that Bolivia is on track to remain an eastern ally for years to come, despite also having quite complicated relations with the east as well, similarly to Serbia. Because Serbia's diplomacy is kind of like a pendulum that goes back and forth from either wanting to be a east or west ally. Okay, and let's move on to the final continent. Oceania, Papua New Guinea. So similar to the Americas, a lot of countries in Oceania can tick the first and second box in some way or another. So it came down to the third box, and I narrowed it down to Papua New Guinea. Many people in the geography community have had their eye on a particular part of Papua New Guinea for a long time. That specific part is Bougainville, because it is set to be the world's newest sovereign country for 2027. At the time of me recording, it's only 2023. Barely! So it'll be a while till we see any official map changes, but the fact that it's happening at all generally just makes the geography community excited, because we are that boring. Self-deprecation aside, I've likened Bougainville's soon-to-be sovereignty to another country that gained independence in the 21st century. Well, depending on who you ask. But either way, I'm clearly talking about Kosovo. So why don't I relay some similarities to you right now? So both Bougainville and Kosovo seek autonomy, obviously. Both are ethnically connected to a neighboring country. For Kosovo, it's Albania, as 92% of the ethnic makeup of Kosovo is Albanian, whereas Bougainville, they're more connected to the Solomon Islands, as they are a part of the Solomon Islands archipelago. And even when they initially declared independence from Papua New Guinea, they called themselves the Republic of North Solomons. Both came to be from wars that ended around the same time, Kosovo in 1999 and Bougainville in 1998. Both are quite pro-West comparative to their counterparts, with Kosovo being overwhelmingly pro-NATO and EU, and Bougainville was protected by the US during World War II, and even recently with Ismail Tourama has shown disdain towards potential Chinese involvement, which if you're a Pacific island, it's quite the bold move. And that's all the similarities I could think of for the two autonomous regions. But let's get back to PNG. For box 1, as I said earlier, many oceanic countries, if not all, can tick this box, and PNG is no different. Many foreign powers have had control over the island, but I'd say one of the most relevant ones for this context is the German Second Reich, as they were the first ones to include Bougainville with their colony, when previously there was no association with the two islands. Because then Australia let Papua New Guinea become independent in 1975, and included Bougainville with Papua New Guinea for some reason. But many attribute Bougainville's inclusion to Papua New Guinea with the fact that German New Guinea included Bougainville as that colony. And that's a tick for box 2 as well, as Australia and PNG have always had strong diplomatic ties. And overall, I'd say Papua New Guinea is a decent pick for Serbia of Oceania. Now, to rank these countries, I think I'm gonna make Armenia the best. The Orthodox Christian roots, the mutual disdain towards the Ottomans, ties to Russia and Greece. It really is a match made in heaven. And for the rest of the 3 entries, like I said, I'd say they're about equal, but if I was being really picky, I'd say Bolivia in second place, Central African Republic in third, and Papua New Guinea at the bottom. Sorry, PNG. Although in terms of disputed territories, I'd actually say that it applies the best in terms of like Serbia's predicament, but it simply just came down to the fact that it's never really had that element of going back and forth from an East and West alliance. And there we have it, the Serbias of each continent. This has been the most difficult one for me so far, as Serbia is a country that's very difficult to describe. So all the entries being countries that are difficult to describe with many history lessons is pretty fitting, to be honest. If you agree or disagree with my picks and rankings, let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.